When the Korean War comes up, the conversation usually turns to sweeping advances, frozen retreats, and the hard arithmetic of hills taken and lost. What tends to disappear is the smaller, decisive struggle that played out behind doors. Schoolhouse doors, tenement doors, factory office doors, where control of a single threshold could determine whether a position held for hours or collapsed in minutes. This is not a story about heroics or last stands. It is about a practical reality most armies relearned the hard way. In close, fluid fighting, the ability to deny access mattered as much as firepower. Barricading doors was not an improvisation born of panic. It was a method rooted in older military experience, carried forward by necessity, and quietly influential in how modern forces think about urban survival and interior defence. Barricading did not begin as a civilian habit, but as a military response to close combat. Long before the Korean Peninsula became a battleground, soldiers learned that fortifications fail from the inside as often as from the outside. In early modern warfare, doors in towns under siege were reinforced because attackers rarely breached walls first. They infiltrated through buildings already taken. By the Second World War, especially in places like Stalingrad and Manila, barricading doors became an accepted interior defence practice. It was not about creating an impenetrable barrier. It was about buying time, shaping enemy movement, and forcing attackers to expose themselves. Veterans who carried this knowledge into Korea did not frame it as doctrine. They framed it as survival sense learned in earlier wars. The Korean War forced armies into buildings that, honestly, just weren't designed for defence. Korea's urban and semi-urban structures, well, they posed a unique challenge. Many of the buildings were lightly constructed, with thin doors and interior walls that offered very little ballistic protection. Yet, with the war's shifting front lines and those frequent night attacks, units often had to hold temporary positions inside villages and towns. Barricading doors in these environments was less about strength, really, and more about control. A blocked door slowed entry, created noise, and provided a psychological signal that a space was occupied and defended. In a conflict marked by infiltration and surprise, those seconds of warning mattered. Barricades were about delay, not denial, and soldiers understood that distinction clearly. One of the most misunderstood aspects of old-school barricading is the belief that it aimed to stop an enemy completely. In reality, experienced soldiers assumed any determined attacker would eventually get through. The purpose was to force effort, create friction, and break momentum. A barricaded door required tools, coordination, or exposure to clear. That delay allowed defenders to reposition, prepare, or withdraw in an orderly way. This understanding influenced later military thinking, where time became a measurable defensive resource rather than an abstract hope. Material choice reflected environment and logistics rather than theory. Accounts from Korea describe barricades built from furniture, debris, ammunition crates, and even frozen earth packed against doors. These were not textbook solutions, but adaptations to scarcity. The lesson here is not about the materials themselves, but about decision-making under constraint. Soldiers used what was heavy, awkward, and immediately available. This pragmatic approach contrasts sharply with post-war training environments, which often assume standardized equipment. The Korean War reminded militaries that real-world conditions rarely match training assumptions. Barricading also shaped how soldiers moved inside buildings. A barricaded door, really altered interior behaviour. Units learned to avoid predictable entry points, to establish interior fallback positions, and to treat rooms as temporary shelters rather than, safe havens. This mindset reduced casualties during sudden breaches and influenced later room-clearing doctrine. Modern urban operations emphasize layered defense and controlled movement, concepts that trace their lineage to these earlier improvised practices. What appears simple on the surface, blocking a door, had ripple effects on how entire buildings were used defensively. There was a psychological dimension that modern analyses often overlook. Barricades affected morale on both sides. For defenders, a reinforced door provided a sense of order in chaotic conditions. It marked a boundary, however fragile, between safety and threat. Failures taught as much as successes, especially when barricades were misused. Not every barricade helped. In some cases, poorly planned barricading trapped defenders, limited escape routes, or created blind spots. After-action reports noted instances where units barricaded themselves into untenable positions, mistaking delay for protection. These failures, informed later training, emphasizing that interior defenses must always preserve mobility. The Korean War contributed to a clearer understanding that static defense inside buildings carries inherent risks unless paired with clear exit strategies. By the late 20th century, formal military doctrine began to articulate principles that echo these experiences. Control access points, shape enemy movement, and, prioritize time over territory. Rarely do manuals mention Korea when outlining these ideas, yet the conflict served as a proving ground. Urban operations in later wars benefited from an accumulated, if unspoken, body of knowledge forged in those earlier, less documented encounters. What these practices reveal about warfare is honestly more important than the techniques themselves. Barricading doors during the Korean War, for example, really highlights a broader truth about conflict. Wars are not only decided by strategy and technology, but by countless small decisions made under pressure. These decisions often draw on inherited knowledge rather than, formal instruction. Understanding this helps explain why armies that adapt survive longer, even when they're outmatched. It also reminds us that progress in warfare is often incremental, built on quiet lessons rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Remembering these overlooked details matters because they shape how we prepare today. Studying old-school barricading is not about nostalgia or imitation. It's really about recognizing how humans respond to danger when systems fail and resources are thin. The Korean War offers a case study in adaptation, where soldiers bridge the gap between past experience and present necessity. By paying attention to these details, we gain a more honest understanding of warfare and the people who endure it. The history of war is often told through maps and major engagements, but it is sustained by the unseen work done behind doors and within rooms. These stories deserve attention because they explain how conflicts are actually lived and survived. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis, consider subscribing to Warfield Survivor and sharing this video with others who want a deeper understanding of the wars that shaped the modern world.